Two children stood at Samuel Thornton's gate, barefoot, starving, and clutching a letter from the only woman he had ever loved, a woman who had been dead for 3 weeks. Behind them, somewhere in the 50 miles of wilderness they had crossed, armed men were coming to drag them back. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The evening sun hung low over the Montana plains, casting long amber shadows across the weathered wooden fences of the Thornton Ranch when Samuel Thornton first saw them standing at his gate. Two children, barefoot and filthy, their clothes torn and caked with dust from what must have been days of hard travel. The older one was a girl of perhaps 14, her hair matted and tangled, her face streaked with grime and the unmistakable tracks of dried tears. She clutched something to her chest with one hand, while the other arm wrapped protectively around a younger boy who couldn't have been more than 7. The boy pressed against her side, his eyes wide and hollow with exhaustion, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from pushing a small body far beyond its natural limits. Samuel had been 63 years old for exactly 1 week, and in all those years of ranching this unforgiving land, he had never seen anything quite like the sight before him now. He stepped out from the barn door where he'd been checking on a colicky mare, his boots heavy on the wooden planks as he approached these unexpected visitors. The girl's eyes found his immediately, tracking his movement with a mixture of desperate hope and barely contained fear that made something twist painfully in his chest. "We walked 5 days to find you, sir," the girl said, her voice cracked and hoarse from thirst and disuse. 5 days across the mountains and through the valley. We slept in ditches and ate berries and drank from streams, and twice we had to hide from men on horses who didn't look friendly. She swallowed hard, the motion visible in her thin throat. "But we found you. We found the Thornton Ranch, just like Mama said we would." Samuel stopped a few feet from the gate, his weathered hands finding the fence post beside him for support. Something about the way she said "Mama" made his heart stutter in his chest. He studied the girl's face more carefully now, searching for something he couldn't quite name, some familiar feature or expression that might explain the strange electricity crackling through his veins. "How did you know my name?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. How did two children find their way across 50 miles of wilderness to a ranch most folks in the territory have never heard of? The girl lifted the object she'd been clutching to her chest, and Samuel saw that it was a letter, folded and refolded so many times that the paper had gone soft as cloth. The edges were stained with what might have been water or tears or both, but the girl handled it as though it were made of spun gold. "Mama wrote it all down," she said. "Before she died, she made me memorize the directions. She said if anything ever happened to her, we were to find Samuel Thornton of the Thornton Ranch in Madison County. She said you were the only person in the world who could help us now." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. He gripped the fence post harder, his knuckles going white beneath skin weathered to leather by decades of sun and wind. "Who was your mother?" he asked, though some part of him already knew, already felt the answer forming in the hollow space beneath his ribs where his heart used to beat steady and sure. "Her name was Caroline," the girl said. "Caroline Whitmore. She used to be Caroline Hartley before she married our father." The girl paused, and something shifted in her expression, a hardening that seemed too old for her young face. "She said you knew her a long time ago. She said you were the kindest man she ever met, and that if we ever needed help, you would give it without question." Caroline. The name echoed through Samuel's mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through memories he had buried deep beneath 30 years of solitary ranching and careful forgetting. Caroline Hartley, with her copper hair and laughing eyes, who had promised to wait for him while he went west to make his fortune. Caroline, who had written him letters full of hope and plans for their future, until one day the letters simply stopped, and the next news he received was that she had married a merchant named Thomas Whitmore and moved to California. He had never blamed her. A woman couldn't wait forever, and he had taken too long establishing himself. Too many years building something from nothing on this unforgiving land. By the time he had a home worth offering, she belonged to someone else. He had made his peace with it, or so he had told himself during the long winter nights when her memory crept unbidden into his dreams. "Your mother," he said slowly. She passed on. The girl nodded, and he saw her jaw tighten against the grief that threatened to crack her careful composure. 3 weeks ago, the fever took her. She held on for 7 days, long enough to make me promise I'd bring Tommy to you. She looked down at the boy pressed against her side, and for a moment her fierce protectiveness softened into something achingly tender. "She said you'd know what to do. She said you'd keep us safe." Samuel looked at the 2 children standing at his gate, these remnants of a love he had thought lost forever, and felt something shift inside him. He had lived alone for 30 years, convinced himself he preferred it that way, built walls around his heart as sturdy as the fences around his cattle. But looking at these exhausted, desperate children who had walked 50 miles through wilderness on nothing but their mother's faith in a man she hadn't seen in 3 decades, he felt those walls begin to crumble. "You'd better come inside," he said, his voice thick with emotions he couldn't name. "Both of you. There's food on the stove and hot water for washing, and beds that haven't been slept in for longer than I care to admit." He opened the gate with hands that trembled slightly, and the girl's eyes filled with tears she was too proud to shed. "We'll sort out the rest of it tomorrow, after you've eaten and rested. But right now you're safe. You understand me? You're safe." The girl took her first step through the gate, pulling her brother gently along with her, and Samuel Thornton felt the weight of his solitary years settle around him like a coat he was finally ready to remove. The inside of the ranch house was sparse but clean, the home of a man who had learned to need very little and want even less. Samuel guided the children to the long wooden table in the kitchen, pulling out chairs that scraped against the worn floorboards, with sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. The girl helped her brother into a seat, her movements careful and practiced, the gestures of someone who had been caring for another person for far longer than any child should have to. Samuel busied himself at the stove, grateful for the excuse to turn his back and compose himself. His hands moved automatically through the familiar motions of heating leftover stew and slicing bread, while his mind raced through questions he wasn't sure he was ready to ask. Caroline had sent her children to him. After 30 years of silence, after a lifetime lived apart, she had remembered him in her final moments and trusted him with the most precious things she had. "What are your names?" he asked without turning around, his voice carefully neutral. "Your real names, the ones your mother gave you." "I'm Eleanor," the girl said. "Ellie, mostly. And this is Thomas, but everyone calls him Tommy. He's 7. I'm 14. She paused, and he heard the slight catch in her breath. "Mama named him after our father, but she said she named me after her grandmother, who was the bravest woman she ever knew." Samuel ladled stew into 2 bowls and set them on the table, then filled 2 glasses with cool water from the pump. The children stared at the food with naked hunger, but neither moved to eat until he nodded his permission. Then they fell upon the meal with a desperation that told him exactly how little they had eaten during their 5-day journey. He sat across from them, watching as they ate, and tried to reconcile the woman he had known with the mother these children described. The Caroline he remembered had been gentle and sheltered, a minister's daughter who had never known hardship or want. What kind of life had she lived, that her children knew how to survive in the wilderness, how to hide from dangerous men, how to push through exhaustion and fear to reach a destination 50 miles away? "Your father," Samuel said when they had slowed their eating enough to hear him. "Thomas Whitmore. Is he looking for you?" Eleanor's hand tightened on her spoon, and something dark flickered across her young face. "Our father died 4 years ago," she said flatly. "His business failed and he couldn't face the shame of it. Mama found him in his study one morning." She glanced at Tommy, whose attention was fixed entirely on his bowl. "After that, Mama tried to keep things together, but the creditors took everything. We moved from San Francisco to a boarding house, then to a smaller town, then smaller still. She took in sewing and washing, anything she could find." The story was painfully familiar. Samuel had seen it happen to other families during hard times, the slow slide from respectability into poverty, the desperate scramble to maintain appearances while everything crumbled. But hearing that Caroline had suffered such a fate made something in him burn with impotent rage. "The men you mentioned," he said carefully. "The ones you had to hide from. Who were they?" Eleanor set down her spoon and met his eyes directly, and Samuel saw in her gaze a maturity that had been forged in fires no child should have to endure. "They work for a man named Silas Crenshaw. He owns half the town where we were living. Mama borrowed money from him when she got sick to pay for medicine and the doctor, but she couldn't pay it back, and Crenshaw said he'd take what was owed him one way or another. She didn't elaborate, but she didn't need to. Samuel understood exactly what a man like Crenshaw would consider acceptable payment if from a widow with 2 children and no means of defense. His jaw tightened until his teeth ached. "This Crenshaw," he said. "Would he send men this far to collect on a debt?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "He said Mama owed him $300. He said he'd find us wherever we went, that nobody cheated Silas Crenshaw and got away with it." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "That's why Mama made me memorize the directions so carefully. She said you were far enough away that Crenshaw might not follow, and strong enough to protect us if he did." $300. It was a significant sum, but not an impossible one for a man who had spent 30 years building a successful cattle operation. Samuel had more than that in the strong box beneath his bedroom floorboards, money saved for emergencies and the eventual decline of his working years. He had never had anyone to spend it on, no wife or children to provide for, no family to leave it to when he died. Perhaps, he thought, this was why. "You're safe here," he said again, and this time the words carried the weight of a vow. "I don't care how far this Crenshaw is willing to travel or how many men he sends. This is my land, and while you're on it, you're under my protection. Do you understand?" Eleanor's composure finally cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks, cutting fresh tracks through the grime, and her shoulders shook with sobs she had been holding back for God knew how long. Tommy looked up from his bowl with alarm, reaching for his sister's hand, and Samuel felt his heart break for these children who had been through so much and still had the capacity to worry about each other. He rose from his chair and moved around the table, kneeling beside Eleanor's seat so that his weathered face was level with hers. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, he placed one calloused hand over both of hers, where they lay clutched together in her lap. "Your mother was right to send you here," he said quietly. "Whatever else happens, know that she made the right choice. I won't let anyone hurt you, either of you. That's a promise from a man who has never broken his word." Eleanor looked at him through her tears, searching his face for something, perhaps the kindness her mother had remembered, perhaps proof that this stranger could truly be trusted with their lives. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded once and squeezed his hand with surprising strength. That first night, Samuel gave the children his own bedroom, the largest and most comfortable room in the house. He made up the bed with fresh linens that smelled of cedar from the chest where they had lain unused for years, and he lit a lamp on the nightstand so they would not wake in unfamiliar darkness. Tommy fell asleep almost immediately, his small body finally surrendering to the exhaustion it had been fighting for days. But Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, watching Samuel move around the room, her eyes tracking his every movement with the wariness of a creature that had learned to expect betrayal. "You should sleep," Samuel said gently, pausing at the doorway. "Tomorrow will be soon enough for questions and plans. Tonight, you just need to rest." "Mr. Thornton," Eleanor said, and her voice was small in a way it had not been before, young and uncertain and afraid. "Why are you helping us? You don't know us. Mama said you were kind, but kindness has limits. People always want something in return." The question cut deeper than she could have known. Samuel leaned against the doorframe, considering his answer carefully. This girl had seen too much of the world's cruelty to accept easy reassurances. She needed truth, even if it was complicated. "I loved your mother once," he said finally. "A long time ago, before you were born, before she married your father. I wanted to make her my wife, but I was young and poor and too proud to ask her to share a hard life. So I came out here to build something worthy of her, and by the time I had, she belonged to someone else." He paused, letting the old grief wash over him and recede like a familiar tide. "I never stopped caring about her happiness, knowing she suffered, knowing she faced hard times alone. That sits heavy on my conscience. Helping you and your brother, it doesn't make up for the years I wasn't there, but it's something. It's the only thing I can still give her." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, processing his words with the serious attention of someone who had learned to weigh every piece of information for hidden dangers. "She talked about you sometimes," she said at last, "when Papa was in one of his moods, or when money was tight and she was scared. She would get this faraway look, and once I heard her whisper your name like a prayer. I didn't understand then, but I think I do now." Samuel nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. "Get some sleep, Eleanor. You're safe here, and tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." He closed the door softly behind him and walked out onto the front porch, where the night air was cool and clean and carried the distant lowing of cattle settling in for the night. The stars spread across the sky in countless thousands, the same stars Caroline had once pointed out to him during long summer evenings when they had walked together along the river near her father's church. He had not allowed himself to think of those times in years, had packed them away in the same mental strongbox where he kept his savings, treasures too precious for everyday handling. But now the memories came flooding back unbidden. Caroline's laugh, bright and musical, the way she had tilted her head when she was thinking, the softness of her hand in his during those stolen moments when propriety looked the other way. He had been so certain they would have a lifetime together, so confident that love would be enough to bridge the gap between his ambitions and her expectations. He had been young and foolish and wrong about so many things. The letter Eleanor had carried sat on the kitchen table where she had left it, and Samuel found himself drawn to it despite his better judgment. He lit the kitchen lamp and unfolded the worn paper with trembling hands, recognizing Caroline's handwriting immediately, despite the 30 years since he had last seen it. "My dearest Samuel," the letter began, and the words blurred as his eyes filled with unexpected tears. "If you are reading this, then I am gone and my children have found their way to you. I have no right to ask anything of you after so many years of silence, after the choice I made that took me away from the life we might have had together. But I am asking anyway, because I have no one else, and because I believe in my heart that you are still the man I remember, the man who would have moved mountains to keep me safe if I had only been brave enough to let him." Samuel sat down heavily in the nearest chair, the letter shaking in his grip. "Eleanor is strong and clever and far too old for her years. She has had to be these past 4 years since Thomas died. She has been mother and father and protector to Tommy, and she has borne burdens that would have broken grown men. But she is still a child, Samuel, still in need of guidance and care and the chance to simply be young for a while. Please give her that. Please give her the childhood I could not provide. Tommy is gentle and good, with a heart too tender for the world we live in. He reminds me of you sometimes, the way you used to look at the world with such hope and determination. He needs a father, Samuel. He needs a man to show him how to be strong without being cruel, how to stand up for what is right even when it costs everything. I am sorry I never wrote to you. I was ashamed of the choice I made, ashamed of what my life became after I made it. Thomas was not a bad man, but he was not you, and I think we both knew it from the beginning. I have carried your memory like a secret flame all these years, warming myself on what might have been when the present grew too cold to bear. Take care of my children, Samuel. Love them as I loved you, completely and without reservation. And know that wherever I am, I will be watching over all 3 of you, grateful beyond words for the kindness of a man I never deserved, but never stopped loving. Yours always, Caroline." Samuel sat in the lamplight for a long time, the letter pressed against his heart, and let 30 years of buried grief finally rise to the surface. Morning came with the pale gold light of early autumn spilling through the windows of the ranch house and finding Samuel already awake, already working. He had not slept, not really. The letter had kept him company through the long dark hours, its words burning themselves into his memory until he could recite them without looking. Now he moved through the familiar routines of ranch life with mechanical precision, drawing comfort from the simple physical tasks that had sustained him through decades of solitude. He fed the horses and checked on the colicky mare, who had improved overnight and greeted him with a soft nicker of recognition. He gathered eggs from the henhouse and milked the 2 dairy cows that provided butter and cheese for his table. By the time the sun had fully cleared the eastern mountains, he had breakfast cooking on the stove and coffee brewing strong and dark the way he liked it. The children emerged from the bedroom together, Tommy clutching his sister's hand and looking around the unfamiliar house with wide, uncertain eyes. They had washed their faces and hands, Samuel noted with approval, and Eleanor had done her best to smooth her tangled hair into something resembling order. In the morning light, cleaned of the worst of the trail dust, he could see Caroline's features in her daughter's face more clearly now. The same delicate bone structure, the same determined set of the jaw, the same copper highlights in hair that would be beautiful once properly cared for. "Sit down," Samuel said, gesturing toward the table. "Breakfast is almost ready. I hope you both like eggs and bacon because that's what we're having." Tommy's eyes went round at the mention of bacon, and Eleanor's careful composure slipped just enough to reveal the hungry child beneath. Samuel served them generous portions and watched with quiet satisfaction as they ate with slightly less desperation than the night before. Food and rest had already begun their healing work, though he knew it would take far more than one night to undo the damage of their journey and the grief that had prompted it. "After breakfast," he said, settling into his own chair with a cup of coffee, "we need to talk about some practical matters. First, you both need proper clothes. What you're wearing isn't fit for anything but burning. There's a general store in town about an hour's ride from here, and we'll go this afternoon to get you outfitted." Eleanor immediately stiffened, and Samuel saw the familiar wariness return to her eyes. "We can't go into town," she said quickly. "If Crenshaw's men are looking for us, that's the first place they'll ask questions. A man traveling with 2 children matching our description would be remembered." The girl's instinct for survival impressed him, even as it broke his heart. No child should have to think in such terms, calculating risk and exposure like a hunted animal. But she was right, and her caution was warranted. "Fair point," Samuel acknowledged. "I'll go alone then, and bring back what you need, but that raises another matter we need to discuss. How much does this Crenshaw know about where you were heading? Did your mother tell anyone about her connection to me?" Eleanor shook her head slowly, thinking back. "Mama was careful. She only told me about you in private when Tommy was asleep. She said it was important that nobody else know in case someone tried to use the information against us." Her brow furrowed. "But she did write to you maybe 6 months ago, a letter asking if you were still at this address, if you might be willing to help if things got bad. Did you receive it?" Samuel felt something cold settle in his stomach. "No," he said. "I never got any letter. The mail comes through the general store in town, and old Hutchins has been known to be careless with sorting, but still, a letter from California should have reached me." The implications hung heavy in the air between them. If Caroline's letter had gone astray, or worse, been intercepted, then Crenshaw might have more information about their destination than Eleanor realized. Samuel's mind raced through possibilities and preparations, the tactical thinking he had learned during his brief time in the territorial militia rising to the surface after years of dormancy. "Here's what we're going to do," he said, his voice taking on the calm authority of a man accustomed to making decisions in difficult circumstances. "Today, I'll ride into town alone and ask some careful questions. If strangers have been around asking about a woman and 2 children from California, Hutchins or someone else will have heard about it. I'll also send a telegram to a friend of mine in Helena, a lawyer who handles my cattle contracts. He'll know how to find out more about this Crenshaw and whether he has the resources to pursue a debt this far." Eleanor listened intently, and Samuel could see her evaluating his plan with the same sharp intelligence her mother had possessed. "What about the ranch?" she asked. "If someone comes while you're gone, how will we know if they're friend or enemy?" It was an excellent question, and Samuel answered it by rising from the table and crossing to the large cabinet against the far wall. He opened it to reveal an array of firearms that made Eleanor's eyes widen. Rifles, shotguns, and pistols, all clean and well-maintained. The tools of a man who lived alone in country where the law was often too far away to help. "Can you shoot?" he asked, selecting a Winchester rifle and checking its action with practiced ease. "Mama taught me," Eleanor said quietly. "After Papa died, when we started moving from place to place, she said a woman alone needed to know how to defend herself and her children." Samuel nodded, unsurprised. The Caroline who had survived widowhood and poverty and raised 2 children alone was not the sheltered girl he had known, but a woman forged by hardship into something stronger. He handed Eleanor the rifle and watched as she checked it with competent hands, her movements sure and confident. "Anyone comes to this house while I'm gone, you don't open the door until you know who they are and what they want. The neighbors know me, and they know I live alone. If someone claims to be a friend but can't tell you the name of my horse or my brand, you treat them as a threat. Understood?" Eleanor met his eyes steadily. Understood. Tommy had been watching this exchange with growing alarm, his young face pale beneath the remnants of trail dirt. Samuel knelt beside the boy's chair and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Hey now," he said softly. "None of that scared look. Your sister's going to take good care of you while I'm gone, and I'm going to be back before you know it. You trust me?" Tommy studied him for a long moment with those solemn eyes. Then, slowly, he nodded. The ride into town took just under an hour, following a trail Samuel had worn smooth over 3 decades of trips for supplies and business. The day was clear and bright, the kind of autumn morning that made the Montana Territory feel like God's own country, endless sky and rolling grassland and mountains rising purple in the distance. Under other circumstances, Samuel might have enjoyed the journey, letting his mind wander through the pleasant emptiness that came from being alone in beautiful country. But today his thoughts were fixed on darker matters, on the children he had left behind and the threat that might be pursuing them. He pushed his horse harder than usual, covering the distance in 45 minutes instead of the usual hour, and arrived in town with dust on his boots and urgency in his heart. Millbrook was a modest settlement, no more than 100 buildings clustered along a single main street that served as the commercial heart of the surrounding ranches and farms. There was a general store, a blacksmith, a small hotel that catered to travelers, and 3 saloons that catered to everyone else. The church stood at one end of town, white-painted and hopeful, while the undertaker occupied the other end with grim practicality. Samuel knew every building, every face, every name. He had watched this town grow from a handful of tents into something approaching civilization. His first stop was the general store, where Ezra Hutchins presided over his domain of dry goods and gossip with equal enthusiasm. The old man looked up from his ledger as Samuel entered, his weathered face creasing into a smile of welcome. "Sam Thornton, as I live and breathe. Didn't expect to see you until next week when the feed shipment comes in. What brings you to town on a Thursday?" Samuel approached the counter with deliberate casualness, not wanting to seem too eager for information. "Need some things for the house, clothes mostly. Had some unexpected guests arrive and they came with nothing but what they were wearing." Hutchins raised an eyebrow with undisguised curiosity. "Guests? You? Sam, I've known you 30 years, and you've never had a visitor stay longer than it takes to drink a cup of coffee. Who are these mysterious guests?" Samuel had anticipated the question and prepared his answer carefully. "Distant relatives from back east, children of a cousin I haven't seen in years. Their mother passed on, and they had nowhere else to go." It was close enough to the truth to be believable, and vague enough to discourage further inquiry. Hutchins nodded sympathetically, though his eyes remained bright with curiosity. "That's hard, losing family like that. Well, you've come to the right place. What sizes are we talking about?" While Samuel selected shirts and trousers and sturdy boots in sizes he estimated would fit Eleanor and Tommy, he steered the conversation toward more pressing matters. "Say, Ezra, have there been any strangers through town lately? I heard there might be some trouble down California way. Men looking for folks who owe money. Wanted to make sure none of that business followed my relatives up here." Something flickered in Hutchins' expression, quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough. Funny you should mention that. Had 3 men come through just yesterday asking questions about a woman and 2 children traveling from California. Said they were family looking to reunite with lost kin, but they didn't look like any family I'd want to claim. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. Hard men, Sam, the kind who carry guns like they know how to use them and don't mind doing so. I didn't like the look of them one bit. Samuel felt ice form in his veins, but he kept his expression neutral. Did they say where they were headed? Asked about all the ranches in the area, who lived where, whether anyone had taken in strangers recently. I didn't tell them anything useful. None of my business who comes and goes on other people's property. Hutchins paused meaningfully. But they were thorough, Sam. Talked to just about everyone in town before they rode out. Could be they got information from someone less discreet than me. Samuel absorbed this news with growing dread. If Crenshaw's men had been asking about ranches, it was only a matter of time before someone mentioned the Thornton place. The territory was vast, but his ranch was well known, and curious strangers asking about children would eventually find someone willing to talk. Which direction did they ride when they left, he asked. South toward the Miller spread, but that was yesterday afternoon. They could be anywhere by now. Samuel paid for his purchases quickly, his mind already racing through preparations and contingencies. He needed to get back to the ranch, needed to make sure Eleanor and Tommy were safe, needed to prepare for the possibility that violence was coming, whether he wanted it or not. As he loaded the supplies onto his horse, he noticed Sheriff Tom Bradley walking across the street toward him. Bradley was a good man, honest and capable, but limited in what he could do about trouble that originated in another state. Still, it couldn't hurt to let him know what might be coming. Sam, Bradley said, tipping his hat in greeting. Hutchins said you were asking about those strangers from yesterday. You expecting trouble? Samuel tightened the straps on his saddlebags before answering. Maybe. Got some children staying with me, relatives from California. Their mother owed money to a bad man before she died, and it seems he sent people to collect. I'm hoping it won't come to anything, but you know how these things can go. Bradley's expression hardened. Debt collectors from out of state have no authority here. If they try anything on your property, you're within your rights to defend yourself and anyone under your protection. You know that. Samuel swung up into the saddle and looked down at the sheriff with grim determination. I know it, he said, and if they come for those children, they're going to learn it the hard way. He turned his horse toward home and rode faster than he had ever ridden in his life. The ranch was quiet when Samuel returned, the kind of stillness that could mean peace or could mean something far worse. He slowed his horse as he approached, scanning the property with eyes trained by decades of vigilance. The barn door was closed as he had left it. The chickens scratched contentedly in their yard. No unfamiliar horses stood at the rail. No strange boot prints marked the dust around the porch. He was halfway to the house when the front door opened and Eleanor appeared, the Winchester rifle held competently in her hands. She had positioned herself to shoot from cover, he noticed with approval, using the door frame as protection while maintaining a clear line of fire toward the approaching rider. Only when she recognized him did she lower the weapon and step fully onto the porch. Any trouble? He asked as he dismounted. No, sir. Tommy and I stayed inside like you said. We heard horses on the road about an hour ago, but they passed by without stopping. She paused, reading something in his expression. Something happened in town. Samuel led his horse to the rail and began unloading the supplies, using the physical activity to organize his thoughts. Crenshaw's men were in Millbrook yesterday, 3 of them, asking questions about a woman and 2 children from California. They rode south when they left, but that doesn't mean they won't double back. Eleanor absorbed this news with remarkable composure, though Samuel saw her knuckles whiten where they gripped the rifle. How long do you think we have? Hard to say. Could be they'll give up and go home. Could be they're already on their way here. He handed her the bundle of new clothes. Either way, we need to be ready. I want you to change into these and help Tommy do the same. Burn what you were wearing. No sense leaving evidence lying around. While the children changed, Samuel began his preparations in earnest. He checked every weapon in the house, ensuring they were loaded and positioned where they could be reached quickly. He filled canteens with fresh water and packed a saddlebag with food that would keep, provisions for a fast escape if escape became necessary. He walked the perimeter of the property, identifying cover positions and lines of fire, planning for a battle he desperately hoped would never come. When Eleanor emerged in her new clothes, a simple cotton dress that fit her properly and made her look almost like the child she was supposed to be, Samuel sat her down at the kitchen table and spread out a rough map he had drawn of the property. "If trouble comes," he said, pointing to the map, "I need you to understand the layout of this land. Here's the house, here's the barn, here's the creek that runs along the eastern boundary. About a mile north, there's a cave in the hillside where I store emergency supplies. If I tell you to run, that's where you go. You take Tommy, and you don't look back, no matter what you hear behind you. Understood?" Eleanor studied the map with fierce concentration. "What about you?" "I'll hold them off as long as I can. Give you time to get clear. Once you're in the cave, you stay hidden until morning. If I don't come for you by sunrise, you keep heading north until you reach the Henderson Ranch. Tell them what happened and ask them to get you to the sheriff in town. Tom Bradley is a good man. He'll make sure you're protected." The girl's eyes glistened, but she blinked the tears away before they could fall. "You're planning to die for us," she said flatly. "You barely know us, and you're planning to die." Samuel reached across the table and took her hand in his, marveling at how small and fragile it seemed despite the strength he knew it possessed. "I'm planning to keep you safe," he corrected gently. "Dying is just one possibility among many. I've survived worse odds than 3 men with guns, and I don't intend to leave you and Tommy alone in the world if I can help it." Tommy wandered in from the bedroom, looking transformed in his new clothes. The shirt was slightly too large, and the pants had been rolled up at the cuffs, but he looked clean and fed and almost healthy. He climbed onto the chair beside Eleanor and leaned against her side, his small face troubled. "Are bad men coming?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Samuel considered lying, considered protecting the boy from the fear that knowledge would bring. But he remembered Eleanor's words about people always wanting something in return, about the lies and betrayals these children had already survived. They deserved truth, even when truth was hard. "Maybe," he said. "There are men looking for you, men who worked for the person your mother owed money to. But I want you to listen to me carefully, Tommy. Whatever happens, whatever you see or hear in the next few days, I need you to remember something. You are not alone anymore. You have your sister, and now you have me, and we are going to protect you with everything we have. Can you be brave for me?" Tommy looked at Samuel with those solemn eyes that reminded him so painfully of Caroline. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Good boy." Samuel ruffled the child's hair gently, the gesture feeling strange and wonderful after so many years of having no one to comfort. "Now, I want you to help your sister with some chores while I finish getting things ready. Can you gather eggs from the hen house without breaking any?" The simple task seemed to ease something in Tommy's expression. He nodded again, more enthusiastically this time, and slid down from his chair. Eleanor followed him to the door, then paused and looked back at Samuel with an expression that held gratitude and fear and something else he couldn't quite name. "Mr. Thornton," she said quietly, "thank you for everything." Samuel watched them walk toward the hen house together, the older sister guiding the younger brother, 2 small figures against the vast Montana sky. "Caroline," he murmured to himself, "I won't fail them, I swear it." The men came at dusk on the second day, riding out of the fading light like specters of ill intent. Samuel spotted them from the barn where he had been keeping watch, 3 dark figures on horseback moving steadily along the road that led to his property. They rode with the unhurried confidence of predators who knew their prey had nowhere left to run. He had sent Eleanor and Tommy to the root cellar beneath the kitchen floor an hour earlier, when the failing light made it impossible to see approaching riders clearly. The cellar was cramped and dark, but it was also invisible to anyone who did not know exactly where to look. Eleanor had gone without argument. pulling the heavy trapdoor closed behind her and her brother with the quiet efficiency of someone who had hidden before. Now Samuel stood alone on his front porch, the Winchester rifle cradled in his arms and a pistol holstered at his hip. He had faced danger before, in his youth when the territory was wilder, and in his militia days when conflicts with hostile forces had tested his courage and skill. But he had never faced danger with so much at stake, never stood between violence and innocent children who depended on him for their very lives. The riders stopped at the gate, silhouettes against the dying sun. Samuel could make out few details at this distance, but he could see enough to know that Hutchins had been right about them. These were hard men, their postures speaking of violence barely restrained, their hands resting casually near their weapons. "Samuel Thornton," the lead rider called out, his voice carrying easily across the still evening air. "We've come a long way to have a conversation with you. Mind if we approach?" Samuel's finger rested lightly on the trigger of his rifle. "That depends on what you want to converse about. State your business." The man laughed, a cold sound without humor. "I think you know our business, Mr. Thornton. We're looking for 2 children who went missing from California about 3 weeks ago. A girl of 14 and a boy of 7 traveling alone. We have reason to believe they might have come this way, and we're hoping you can help us find them." "Never seen any children matching that description," Samuel replied, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "You've wasted a trip." The lead rider shifted in his saddle, and Samuel saw moonlight glint off something metallic at his hip. "That's strange, because we spoke to a woman in town who remembers seeing you buying children's clothes just yesterday. Small sizes, she said, like you were outfitting a young girl and a younger boy." Samuel cursed inwardly. He had been careful, but not careful enough. In a small town, every purchase was noticed. Every deviation from routine was remarked upon and remembered. "I have relatives visiting from back east," he said, maintaining the lie despite its obvious weakness. Their luggage was lost in transit. Nothing mysterious about a man buying clothes for family. The riders exchanged glances, and Samuel could feel the situation balanced on a knife's edge. These men had not ridden 1,000 miles to accept easy explanations. They had come for Eleanor and Tommy, and they would not leave without them unless Samuel gave them a reason to reconsider. "Mr. Thornton," the lead rider said, his tone shifting from false pleasantness to something harder and more honest. "Let me be direct with you. Those children's mother owed our employer a significant sum of money. She died before she could repay it, which means the debt passes to her heirs. We're here to collect what's owed, one way or another. Now you can make this easy by handing them over, or you can make it hard, but either way, we're not leaving empty-handed." Samuel raised the Winchester slowly, settling the stock against his shoulder and sighting down at the barrel at the lead rider's chest. "Here's what I know about debts," he said, his voice cold as winter iron. "A debt dies with the debtor. Those children don't owe your employer a single cent, and even if they did, debt collection doesn't extend to kidnapping minors across state lines. You're a long way from California, gentlemen, and the law in Montana takes a dim view of men who threaten children." The lead rider's hand moved toward his gun, but he stopped when he saw how steady Samuel's aim remained. "You're 1 man against 3. Even if you get one of us, the other 2 will cut you down before you can chamber another round." "Maybe," Samuel acknowledged, "but you'll be dead either way, so what comfort is that to you? And I should mention that I'm not as alone as I appear. I've got friends in this territory, men who don't take kindly to strangers riding in and making threats. If anything happens to me tonight, you won't make it 10 miles before every rancher in the county is hunting you down." It was a bluff, but delivered with enough conviction that the riders hesitated. Samuel pressed his advantage, taking a step forward while keeping his rifle trained on the lead man. "Here's my offer," he said. "You turn around and ride back to California. You tell Silas Crenshaw that the debt is paid, that I'm settling it myself. $300, I believe. I'll have the money wired to whatever account he specifies within the week. In exchange, he forgets those children ever existed. No more men coming to collect, no more threats, no more pursuit. The matter ends here, tonight." The lead rider was silent for a long moment, calculating odds and options. Samuel could see the conflict in his posture. the desire for violence warring with the practical recognition that this situation had become more complicated than anticipated. "That's a generous offer," the man said finally, "but I'm not authorized to negotiate on Mr. Crenshaw's behalf. I'll need to send word back and wait for a response." "You do that," Samuel said. "But while you're waiting, you stay in town. I catch sight of any of you within a mile of my property, I'll consider it a threat and respond accordingly. Are we clear?" The lead rider stared at him for a long moment, hatred burning in his eyes. Then he turned his horse and gestured to his companions. "This isn't over, Thornton," he said as they rode away into the darkness. Samuel watched them go, his rifle still raised, until they disappeared from sight. Samuel did not move from the porch until the sound of hoofbeats had faded entirely into the night. Only then did he lower the rifle and allow himself to breathe, his hands trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. He had faced down 3 armed men and lived to tell about it, but he knew with terrible certainty that the confrontation was merely postponed, not resolved. He found Eleanor and Tommy still huddled in the root cellar, the girl's arms wrapped protectively around her brother in the darkness. When he lifted the trapdoor and lamplight spilled down into the cramped space, Eleanor looked up at him with eyes that held equal measures of hope and dread. "They're gone," Samuel said, reaching down to help her climb out. "For now, but they'll be back, and we need to talk about what happens next." Tommy emerged from the cellar, clinging to his sister's hand, his small face pale and tear-streaked. The boy had been crying silently in the darkness, Samuel realized, too frightened to make a sound but unable to contain his fear entirely. The sight of those tears hardened something in Samuel's heart, transforming his determination into something closer to fury. No child should have to hide in darkness, terrified of men who wanted to use them as payment for a dead woman's debts. No child should know the kind of fear that Tommy carried in his young eyes. Samuel had spent 30 years building a life of peaceful solitude, but in that moment he understood that peace meant nothing if purchased at the cost of innocent suffering. "I offered to pay them," he said, settling Eleanor and Tommy at the kitchen table and pouring warm milk from the pot he had kept simmering on the stove. "The full amount your mother owed, in exchange for leaving you alone. The lead man said he'd have to consult with Crenshaw before accepting." Eleanor wrapped her hands around the warm cup, but did not drink. "He won't accept," she said quietly. "Crenshaw doesn't care about money. He has more than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. What he cares about is power, about making sure everyone knows that nobody escapes him, nobody defies him without consequences." She looked up at Samuel with haunted eyes. "Mama tried to pay him back. She sold everything we had, worked herself to exhaustion, scraped together almost $200. He took the money and told her the debt had doubled because she'd made him wait." The revelation confirmed Samuel's worst suspicions. This was not about $300. This was about a petty tyrant who could not tolerate the thought of a widow and her children slipping beyond his grasp. Men like Crenshaw did not respond to reason or negotiation. They only understood force. "Then we'll have to convince him that pursuing this matter further will cost more than it's worth," Samuel said grimly, "one way or another." The next morning, Samuel rode into town alone, leaving Eleanor armed and watchful at the ranch. He found Sheriff Bradley at the jail, sorting through a stack of wanted posters with the weary diligence of a man who knew most criminals would never be caught. "They came last night," Samuel said without preamble. 3 of them, just like Hutchins described. Made threats, demanded I hand over the children. I ran them off, but they'll be back." Bradley set down the posters and gave Samuel his full attention. "Did they break any laws I can arrest them for?" "Not technically. They stayed on the public road, never set foot on my property, but they made their intentions clear enough." Samuel leaned against the doorframe, feeling the weight of his years more heavily than usual. "Tom, I need to know where I stand legally. If they come back and I have to defend myself and those children, am I going to hang for it?" The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the gravity it deserved. "Montana law is clear on defense of property and persons," he said finally. "If armed men come onto your land with intent to do harm, you have the right to meet force with force. But Samuel, you need to understand something. If you kill those men, even in legitimate self-defense, there will be an investigation. There will be questions about why they were after those children, about debts and obligations that might complicate matters. Samuel had already considered this possibility during the long, sleepless night. The children's mother is dead. Whatever debts she incurred died with her. There's no legal basis for Crenshaw's claim, just the force of his hired guns. I know that, and you know that, but courts have a way of finding complications where none should exist. Bradley stood and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful main street of Millbrook. My advice? Document everything. Write down what happened last night, what those men said, what they threatened. Have witnesses ready to testify about the strangers asking questions in town. Build a record that proves you acted in defense of innocent children against criminal aggression. Samuel nodded slowly. And if the record isn't enough? Bradley turned to face him, and Samuel saw something hard and determined in the sheriff's eyes. Then I'll testify myself. I've known you 30 years, Samuel Thornton. You're the most honest man in this territory. If you say those children need protecting, I believe you. And I'll make damn sure any judge or jury believes it too. It was more support than Samuel had dared hope for. He thanked Bradley and left the jail, his mind already working through the preparations still needed. He stopped at the telegraph office and sent 2 messages, one to his lawyer friend in Helena and one to an old Army comrade who had settled in Butte and might be willing to ride south if trouble escalated beyond what one man could handle. Then he bought ammunition at the general store, enough to withstand a siege if it came to that. Hutchins watched him pile boxes of cartridges on the counter with knowing eyes, but asked no questions. Some transactions required no explanation. By the time Samuel returned to the ranch, the sun was past its peak and sinking toward the western mountains. Eleanor met him at the gate, the rifle still in her hands. "Any trouble?" he asked. "None," she replied. "But I've been thinking. Maybe Tommy and I should leave, head further north where Crenshaw's men can't find us. You've already risked too much for strangers." Samuel dismounted and looked at the girl who had walked 5 days through wilderness on nothing but faith in her mother's memory of a kind man. She was offering to sacrifice her own safety to protect him, just as he was prepared to sacrifice his life to protect her. "You're not strangers," he said quietly. "Not anymore." 3 days passed in tense anticipation, each hour stretching like taffy as Samuel and the children waited for the other shoe to drop. Eleanor helped with chores around the ranch, her capable hands finding purpose in the simple tasks of feeding animals and mending fences. Tommy gradually emerged from his shell of fear, following Samuel around the property with quiet curiosity, asking questions about the horses and cattle and the vast landscape that surrounded their temporary refuge. On the morning of the 4th day, Samuel's telegram was answered. His friend from Helena, a lawyer named Marcus Webb, sent word that he had begun investigating Silas Crenshaw and discovered a pattern of predatory lending and intimidation stretching back 15 years. More importantly, Webb had found 3 other families who had fled California to escape Crenshaw's reach. Families who might be willing to testify if charges were ever brought. It was useful information, but it would take months to translate into legal action. Samuel needed something more immediate if he was going to protect Eleanor and Tommy from the men who had promised to return. The answer came from an unexpected source. That afternoon, a rider approached the ranch from the north, a weathered man in his 50s with a marshal's star pinned to his vest. Samuel met him at the gate with rifle in hand, relaxing only when the man identified himself as Deputy Marshal James Harding, operating out of the federal court in Helena. "Got word from Marcus Webb that you might have a situation developing," Harding said, dismounting with the easy grace of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle. "Thought I'd ride down and see for myself." Samuel invited him inside and explained the situation over coffee while Eleanor listened from the doorway. The marshal took notes in a small leather journal, his weathered face growing grimmer with each detail of Crenshaw's pursuit of a dead woman's children. "Interstate pursuit for debt collection," Harding said when Samuel finished, "especially involving minors with no legal obligation to pay. That falls under federal jurisdiction if I choose to make it so." He looked up from his notes with sharp, assessing eyes. Question is whether these men have committed enough crimes on Montana soil to justify my involvement. They threatened a law-abiding citizen on his own property, Samuel said. Threatened violence against children. Surely that's enough. Threats are slippery things in court. Hard to prove, easy to deny. Harding closed his journal and tucked it into his vest pocket. But if they come back and try something more concrete, that changes the equation. I'd like to stick around for a few days if you don't mind the company. See if our California friends decide to push their luck. Samuel agreed gratefully, and for the next 2 days the ranch operated under a state of armed vigilance. Harding proved to be a useful ally, sharing his experience with similar situations and helping Samuel refine his defensive preparations. Eleanor watched and learned, absorbing knowledge about tactics and positioning that no 14-year-old should need, but that might save her life. Tommy, meanwhile, had attached himself to Samuel with the desperate devotion of a child who had lost too much and feared losing more. He followed the older man everywhere, helped with small tasks, and peppered him with questions about ranching and horses and the life Samuel had built in this remote corner of Montana. In those quiet moments between preparations for violence, Samuel felt something he had never expected to feel again. The stirring of paternal love for a child who was not his own, but who needed him nonetheless. On the evening of the second day, they came. Not 3 men this time, but 5. They rode out of the gathering darkness like an army of shadows, spreading out in a formation that spoke of military training and violent intent. Samuel spotted them from the barn where he had been keeping watch, and his blood ran cold as he counted the riders. "Harding," he called quietly, and the marshal materialized from behind the water trough where he had positioned himself. 5 of them. They've brought reinforcements." The marshal's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Get the children to the cellar, then take position at the house. I'll cover the barn approach." Samuel ran to the house, his aging legs protesting the sudden exertion. Eleanor was already moving, having seen the riders from the kitchen window. She grabbed Tommy's hand and pulled him toward the trapdoor, pausing only to look back at Samuel with eyes that held no fear, only fierce determination. "Don't you dare die," she said. "We didn't walk 5 days to lose you now." Then she was gone, disappearing into the darkness beneath the floor with her brother clutched close. Samuel closed the trapdoor and kicked the rug over it, concealing the entrance as best he could. Then he grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. The riders had stopped at the gate, conferring among themselves in low voices. Samuel could not make out their words, but he could see enough to know that their posture had changed from the previous encounter. These men had come prepared for battle, not negotiation. "Thornton," the lead rider called out, the same cold voice Samuel remembered from before. "We gave you time to reconsider. Crenshaw's answer came this morning. He doesn't want your money. He wants those children delivered to his representatives in Millbrook by noon tomorrow, or we're authorized to take them by force." Samuel's finger found the trigger of his rifle. "Then Crenshaw is going to be disappointed. Those children are under my protection, and they're not going anywhere." The lead rider laughed, that same humorless sound. "One old man and a federal marshal we spotted riding in 2 days ago. You really think that's enough to stop us?" "I think you're about to find out," Samuel replied, and the night exploded into violence. The first shot came from the barn, Harding's rifle cracking through the night air with deadly precision. One of the riders jerked backward in his saddle and tumbled to the ground, his horse screaming and bolting into the darkness. The remaining 4 scattered immediately, seeking cover behind the fence posts and water troughs that dotted the approach to the house. Samuel fired from his window, aiming for the lead rider who had made himself so memorable with his threats and cold laughter. The shot went wide, splintering wood from the gatepost, but it forced the man to dive for cover and gave Samuel time to chamber another round. Return fire peppered the front of the house, shattering glass and punching holes through the wooden walls. Samuel dropped below the windowsill, his heart pounding with the familiar, terrible rhythm of combat. He had hoped never to hear that rhythm again, had spent 30 years building a peaceful life that would never require him to take another human life. But some things were worth fighting for, worth killing for. worth dying for, if it came to that. He rose and fired again, this time catching one of the attackers in the shoulder as the man tried to rush the porch. The wounded man fell back with a cry of pain, dragging himself toward the dubious safety of the fence. 3 men still active, Samuel counted, plus whoever Harding had dropped at the start. The odds were evening, but they were far from favorable. A burst of gunfire from the barn told him Harding was still in the fight. Samuel used the distraction to change position, moving from the front window to a side door that gave him a better angle on the men trying to flank the house. He caught one of them in the open, a clean shot that dropped the attacker where he stood. 2 left, including the leader. But those 2 had learned caution. They had retreated beyond effective rifle range and were conferring in urgent whispers. Samuel could see them in the moonlight, dark shapes against the darker landscape, planning their next move. He knew what they were thinking, because he would have thought the same thing in their position. The direct assault had failed. Time for a different approach. Fire. The thought struck him like a physical blow. They would try to burn him out. He was moving before the thought fully formed, racing toward the kitchen where the trapdoor concealed Eleanor and Tommy. If the house caught fire, the children would be trapped in the cellar with no way out. He had been so focused on hiding them from bullets that he had forgotten about the more insidious threat of smoke and flame. The first torch came through the broken front window as Samuel reached the kitchen, trailing sparks and landing on the dry wooden floor. He stamped it out with his boot, but a second torch followed, then a third, and suddenly the parlor was ablaze with hungry orange light. Samuel threw open the trapdoor. "Out!" he shouted into the darkness. "We have to go now." Eleanor emerged first, pulling Tommy behind her, both children coughing as smoke began to fill the house. Samuel grabbed the boy and lifted him onto his hip, then seized Eleanor's hand and dragged them toward the back door. The heat was already intense, flames climbing the walls with terrifying speed, consuming the home he had built with 30 years of labor and love. They burst out into the cool night air, gasping and stumbling. Samuel set Tommy down and pushed both children toward the barn where Harding was still holding position. Behind them, the house groaned and crackled as fire devoured it from within. A shot rang out and pain exploded through Samuel's left arm. He staggered but did not fall, turning to face the lead rider who had circled around during the confusion. The man stood 20 feet away, his pistol raised for a killing shot, triumph gleaming in his eyes. "Should have taken the deal, old man," he said. The shot that killed him came from behind Samuel, from a Winchester rifle held in the steady hands of a 14-year-old girl who had walked 5 days through wilderness to find a man her mother remembered as kind. Eleanor's face was pale but determined as she watched Crenshaw's man crumple to the ground, the rifle still pressed against her shoulder. The last remaining attacker fled into the night, his horse's hoofbeats fading into the distance. Harding emerged from the barn, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead but otherwise unharmed. He took in the scene with experienced eyes, the burning house, the bodies on the ground, the children huddled together in shock. "It's over," he said quietly. "You did good, all of you." Samuel gathered Eleanor and Tommy into his uninjured arm, holding them close as his home collapsed into embers behind them. Everything he had built was gone, 30 years of memories and possessions reduced to ash and ruin. But the children were safe, alive and whole and protected, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. The weeks that followed brought change and healing in equal measure. Samuel's arm mended cleanly, and the community of Millbrook rallied around him with donations of lumber and labor to rebuild what had been lost. Marshal Harding filed federal charges against Silas Crenshaw based on the testimony of multiple victims, charges that would eventually result in the man's imprisonment and the dissolution of his predatory empire. But the greatest change was quieter, more profound. On a crisp December morning, Samuel stood before Judge Harrison in the Millbrook courthouse and signed papers that made Eleanor and Tommy legally his children. The adoption was witnessed by half the town, including Sheriff Bradley and Old Hutchins from the general store, all of them smiling as a family was formed from the ashes of loss and the bonds of unexpected love. That evening, Samuel sat on the porch of his half-rebuilt home with his children beside him, watching the sun set over the Montana plains. Tommy leaned against his shoulder, drowsy and content, while Eleanor read aloud from a book of poetry her mother had once loved. "We walked 5 days to find you," Eleanor said softly, closing the book and looking up at the man who had become her father. "And it was worth every step." Samuel pulled his children closer and watched the stars emerge, one by one, over the land that was now truly home.